Good evening. Professor John Oldfield is Director of the Wilberforce Institute at the University of Hull and a former member of Southampton Magna Rotary Club. So good evening to you, John, and welcome. The Queen's Anniversary Prize was given to John in recognition of the Wilberforce Institute's research into slavery and emancipation issues. The Institute had a major role in shaping the UK's Modern Slavery Act, passed in 2015. So over to you, John.
John, you're on mute. John, you're on mute.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yep.
Good. Well, thank you very much indeed. Great to be back and to see some old faces. Some of you have not changed a bit. Laurie, you have not changed a bit. This is a big topic, and I'm going to try and give you some, well, not quite a summary, but some sense of the scale of modern or contemporary slavery, as it's sometimes called, and then something about the situation here in the UK. One of the things I'm often asked when I talk about this to general audiences is well, you know, why are we talking about this? Because isn't slavery a thing of the past? Isn't that all over? And what's, I guess, behind those questions is this mental image that slavery was really all about. It is a historical characteristic. It's about enslaved Africans working cotton plantations in the American South. Think of Gone with the Wind, and or sugar plantations in the British Caribbean. What that denotes, that mental picture of slavery, is a highly racialized slavery. To be a slave was to be an African. To be an African was to be a slave. But also what we call chattel slavery, that is the idea of property, the slave as property. A shorthand description of that kind of slavery would be hereditary lifetime service. Your status was defined by your mother's status. If your mother was a slave, then by definition you were a slave. And as property, you were entitled to very few rights or freedoms as we would ordinarily see them. So if you look at slave laws from 17th and 18th century, slaves weren't allowed to marry, to own property, to learn to read or write, to testify in a court of law, and so on and so forth. So the slave was literally a species of property to be disposed of at the master's will. Now, that idea of slavery did come to an end during the 19th century. Britain abolished slavery in 1833, France in 1848, United States in 1865, Brazil, one of the last major slave societies, abolished slavery in 1888. So those people who say, well, that's something in the past, isn't it, are in a sense right. Historical slavery did come to an end, or chattel slavery did come to an end in the late 19th century, but it doesn't disappear altogether. And there are instances of chattel slavery well into the 20th century that is usually associated with forms of debt bondage. What's interesting is that at the same time that definitions of slavery shifted over time. And this is really a combination of a kind of grassroots, bottom-up kind of initiative, but also a top-down initiative. So if you look at the League of Nations in 1926 and the United Nations in 1956, these institutions widen the definition of slavery to include practices, I quote, similar to slavery. That's an interesting idea, practices similar to slavery. And since 1956, these definitions are wider further to include human trafficking, which I'll have something to say about in a minute, forced or servile marriage, sale or exploitation of children, including in armed conflict, and forced labor. So basically now what we're talking about is a very broad definition of slavery. So it's not just about chattel, slave as property, but it's all these other things too: human trafficking, forced or servile marriage, sale or exploitation of children, including in armed conflict, and forced labor. Now that broader definition of what slavery is makes efforts to try and quantify it highly contentious. I'll just raise this now because some of you may have read some of these figures, but there is an estimate from the Global Slavery Index, which is bankrolled by an Australian multi-billionaire. The Global Slavery Index has come up with a figure of 40 million enslaved people in the world today. Now just bear in mind, that is a figure based on this very wide definition of slavery, and not all people accept that all those 40 million people really are enslaved, but are maybe something else. So it's important, I think, to treat some of these figures with a degree of caution. Nonetheless, whether this is 20 million or 40 million, it's still a very significant number of people. So just bear in mind that some of these figures you may have read about, particularly the figure of 40 million, is contentious. More, I think, significant is that behind this idea of, or behind the numbers, has been a conceptual shift from slavery as property to slavery as a form of control. And that's one of the guiding principles of what we call modern slavery. We're not talking now so much about property, but as control. Now these forms of control can take many different kinds. So for instance, it could be confinement, could be a kind of a situation where you are denied your freedom. And if you think of some of those cases that crop up periodically of servants in quite wealthy areas of London, these people who have been kept effectively in captivity for very long periods of time, this is what we're talking about: forms of control where people's mobility and freedom to move around is severely limited. So confinement is one of the things that I think is symptomatic of surveillance or control. Another one is violence and intimidation. So physical threats to workers and their families, confiscation of passports or other forms of identification. And this is not unusual. These situations where where gangmasters effectively deny people their identity by taking away their passports or other forms of identification, which means that they're basically trapped. So how do they, even if they can escape, they have no way of identifying themselves, proving who they are, or really kind of leveraging any kind of support, particularly legal aid. Another form of control would be wage discrimination, poor housing, lack of food and sustenance. And there are lots of situations which we know about where those things have happened. People confined in pretty horrible conditions and denied adequate food and protection, all those kind of things that we would consider necessary for human existence. So what we're talking about here really are forms of exploitation that involve mastery over others, sometimes over relatively short periods of time, but sometimes for many years. In each case, it's really this question of the degree of control that you have over the labor of somebody else, which distinguishes this in law as slavery or modern slavery. Now, key to understanding all this is the notion of human trafficking, which for some people has become synonymous with slavery. In fact, in the United States, it's not unusual for those two terms to be used interchangeably: modern slavery and human trafficking. It's important to say that human trafficking should not be confused with people smuggling, some of what's been going on in the channel right now, where those involved are usually paying quite large sums of money to traffickers to smuggle them into Europe. So these people are paying pretty unscrupulous people to get them from A to B, usually from somewhere in France, Dunkirk, say, to the UK. Human trafficking, on the other hand, usually involves a degree of deception on the part of traffickers, whereby vulnerable people are persuaded to entrust themselves to traffickers who bear all of the related costs, and as a result, therefore, have control over these people. They pay to get them into Europe, and therefore assume a degree of control over them. So trafficking has become a kind of key issue in terms of people who study modern slavery, but also for law enforcement. So, and trafficking really, I think, depends or revolves around three key terms or concepts. One of them is the action of, that is recruitment. The means, usually the means involve a threat or some deception. So you are recruited, not of your own free will, but often through some kind of deception, or you're tricked into kind of going along with this gangmaster. And then of course the purpose is to be exploited. So exploitation, I'll come back to that later. Exploitation is one of the other key determinants of what is trafficking in terms of modern slavery. And then exploitation could be sexual exploitation, but it could be other forms of exploitation, including things like organ harvesting. We have cases of people who have been trafficked for the purpose of harvesting their human organs. So usually livers, but sometimes cornea. And these are documented cases where the form of exploitation is not necessarily what you think, which is prostitution or sexual exploitation. It can be other things too, including the harvesting of human organs. This is pretty gruesome stuff, so just bear with me for a minute, because I was going to give you an example of trafficking, if you like, in motion. We've been doing quite a lot of work in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, and earlier in the year before lockdown, I was in Kenya talking to some NGOs who told us all kinds of stories about human trafficking, things that they'd encountered during the course of their work. And one case stuck in my mind. It's about a local girl. This is living in Uganda, part of a large family, a poor family, desperate for work, desperate to provide for her family, who is enticed to go to Abu Dhabi with the promise of work. And this is not an unusual scenario where somebody comes along, somebody you might know, and says, I've got just the thing for you. Would you like to go and work in Abu Dhabi? You'll have a much better quality of life. You'll be able to earn money, send it back to your family, and so on. You might be able to guess what happens next. When she gets there, however, she found that not only was she confined to a family compound where she was expected to do the bulk of the domestic work, but she was also expected to provide sexual favors to the family's mentally handicapped son, with the idea of providing him with a son and heir. And as part of this kind of routine, she was regularly taken to a maternity hospital to be checked whether she was pregnant, and therefore sort of carried out her side of the bargain, so to speak. And it was on one of those visits that she escaped. And it's why we know about this case, that this is precisely what had happened to her. Now that might seem very extreme. It is very extreme in terms of its details, but it portrays, I think, many of the characteristics of human trafficking, namely being tricked into doing something by someone who is trying to exploit you for their own purposes, and then will treat you in the most inhuman and inhumane condition, inhumane way. And when we were in Kenya, we were told lots of stories like this. Some of them involving family members who thought they were acting in with the best interest of their children at heart, but then suddenly realized later what had happened to them, and were then sort of bereft and extremely disappointed, for want of a better word, about what had happened to their children. So what we're talking about here are situations where traffickers prey on vulnerable people, offering them all kinds of opportunities. We have instances where young boys, African boys, are being offered so-called lucrative football trials with European football clubs. That's a documented case. We have young women who are being enticed with the promise of modeling careers somewhere in Europe, or work in the entertainment industry. More often, it is simply the promise of regular work and a regular wage, which entices people to take these fateful steps. And what's intriguing about a lot of these cases is just how kind of familiar this is to these people. Often it's, as I said earlier, somebody who they trust, somebody they know, who's making these offers. We have one case where it turned out that a member of a church community, a church congregation, was actually a trafficker and was enticing young girls, this is in Uganda, enticing young girls into effectively slavery as part of very intricate trafficking syndicates. So this is a massive, massive business. According to the International Labour Organization, in a report published in 2014, human trafficking earns profits of roughly $150 billion a year for traffickers. So $150 billion a year. That's in 2014. It's likely to be much more than that right now. So this is hugely profitable for those engaged in it. It's big business, it's criminal business, it's criminal activity orchestrated by gangs who are generally working on the dark web. It's very much below the surface, but it is highly organized. And talking to police about this, these are gangs which are, it's their job to be one step ahead of the police all the time. And they are very, very good at doing that. Now, two things to just stress about this. First of them is about routes. I mean, trafficking routes. And we've spent a lot of time kind of working out what's going on here. Now, some human trafficking takes place across relatively short distances, sometimes within countries. In the United States, for instance, we know of instances where people are literally being trafficked between states. They're not being trafficked out of the country, they're being trafficked between states in the United States. But more often, we are talking about quite long, complex routes. So the one from Africa to the Middle East is quite well known. If you think of the scandals around building the Kuwait World Cup in 2022, and the scandals about the laborers who died building those stadiums, a lot of these would have been trafficked African labor who died as a consequence of taking what turned out to be a making a dreadful mistake. We also know about longer routes which bring people from Southeast Asia, Vietnam, for instance, into Europe. And we also know about routes which bring people from Europe, Eastern Europe in particular, Poland, Romania, Hungary, bringing those people into the UK. And as I said before, a lot of this takes place under the radar, but occasionally the press, things hit the press and you kind of think, goodness, how are those people here? So think back to 2004 cockle pickers, Morecambe Bay. What are these people doing here? Why are they drowning on a beach, Chinese workers? Or why last year, why are 39 Chinese migrants suffocating to death in the back of a lorry in Surrey? This is incredible stuff. And it's all about, unscrupulous people who are, literally moving these people around the huge distances for their own gain. The second thing to say is about occupations. I think this is quite important because there is a tendency to assume that most human trafficking is about prostitution or sexual exploitation, and a lot of it is, but trafficking can affect all kinds of areas. We now know about trafficking in the construction industry, in hospitality, in fishing, agriculture, and manufacturing. So if you go back to some of those, that figure I mentioned about $150 billion in terms of profits, that figure in 2014, of that, $34 billion came from construction and manufacturing, $9 billion from agriculture, and a further $8 billion from domestic service in private households. And in truth, we now think that there's probably hardly a sector of the global economy that is not touched in some way by human trafficking. It's a massive global problem. Okay, so that's the broad picture. I just was then going to say a little bit about the situation in the UK, which may surprise you, I don't know. So here again, some numbers. The most reliable estimate we have for the number of enslaved people in the UK is 13,000. Now that already is an old figure. That was what Theresa May told the House of Commons in 2017, that there were 13,000 enslaved people here in the UK, which we now think is probably an underestimate. We just don't know. We have no way really of accurately knowing how many enslaved people there are. And of course, there are always people who will dispute whether these are enslaved people at all, going back to that definition of slavery I mentioned earlier. Now, most of these people, most of the 13,000, we think are being trafficked from a distance, obviously. Think about construction and agriculture. Many seasonal agricultural workers, particularly in areas like North Lincolnshire, are effectively slaves, confined to remote farms where they have very little economic or physical independence. The same is true, we think, of some workers, and I stress this, some workers in some car washes, not all car washes. I did a presentation like this where somebody came up to me afterwards and said, "Oh, I'll never go to a car wash ever again after what you've just told me." That's not what I was really saying. It was that we know that in some cases, car washes are using trafficked labor, effectively slave labor, as are nail bars. Two areas that police forces are very interested and keep under constant surveillance. Anecdotal evidence suggests that many nail bar workers, particularly young women, many of them from Southeast Asia, are moved around constantly by traffickers so as to escape detection, in the same way that they're often boarded together in cheap hotels, hostels, and B&Bs. And this is something that I was reminded of. Coronation Street for a while ran a story about a young girl working in a nail bar who turned out had been trafficked. So this is beginning to enter sort of mainstream media in terms of storylines of major shows. So a lot of other dramas are now working with these stories about trafficking and exploitation. There are any number of these, just two random examples. In 2017, police in Nottingham discovered a Polish worker who'd been trafficked into the UK, living in a squalid loft, working 20 hours a day, making greeting cards. Somebody had thought it was worth their while to traffic him into the United States, into the United Kingdom, to do that. We also know about Vietnamese workers trafficked into cannabis farms in the UK. Even in Northern Ireland, we came across a case of Vietnamese workers in Northern Ireland growing cannabis, where they effectively live on the job. There's no escape. They're just confined in these, often under plastic, tending after cannabis. And if anything, it seems to me the pandemic, COVID, has made the lives of these people even more difficult because they can't go out. And if they can't go out, it means that they can't really get access to support and help that might enable them to get out of these situations. So this can be pretty desperate stuff. But here's the thing. Not all of these people are trafficked over large distances. In a recent case in Hull, under the Modern Slavery Act of 2015, which I'll come back to in a minute, there's a famous case involving a family tarmacking business. This is in East Yorkshire, who were found guilty of recruiting homeless people off the streets of Hull and submitting them to what amounted to modern slavery. And we know from recent statistics that more and more UK citizens are being reported as victims of modern slavery. The common denominator here is that these people are usually extremely poor, they come from deprived communities, and they're extremely vulnerable. So, you know, why not? If you're recruiting, why not go around the homeless people of Hull offering them opportunities? And those people would probably snap your hand off to be told that they'll get a couple of decent meals very quickly, but then found themselves trapped, literally trapped and controlled by this ruthless family who just drove them into the ground, working day in, day out on this family tarmacking system. Okay, now one of the reasons we know about these cases in the UK is that we have a legislative framework that is designed to criminalize and prosecute modern slavery cases in the shape of the Modern Slavery Act. Rosemary mentioned this earlier. This is a landmark piece of legislation introduced by the then Home Secretary Theresa May in 2015. And Theresa May, whatever you think about her, was an extremely enthusiastic supporter of that piece of legislation and remains an enthusiastic supporter of efforts to tackle modern slavery. And as Rosemary said, we had a hand in some of the consultations around the framing of the Modern Slavery Act and gave some evidence as to on particular clauses, which I won't bore you with. Two things to note about that piece of legislation, the Modern Slavery Act. The first is that it adopts a very broad definition of what modern slavery encompasses. And I mentioned this at the beginning. We are dealing with a very broad definition, which I quote, so for the purposes of the Modern Slavery Act, slavery means slavery, servitude, and forced or compulsory labor and human trafficking. So slavery, servitude, and forced or compulsory labor and human trafficking. That's the broad definition. And you can be prosecuted under the Modern Slavery Act under all of those, under that umbrella of abuses. Moreover, in seeking to define forms of exploitation, Section 3 of the Act identifies the following: sexual exploitation, the removal of human organs, securing services by force, threats, or deception, including the securing of services of children and vulnerable persons. So to make sense of that, under the trafficking provision, if you were trafficking somebody, going back to the kind of the purpose, with the purpose of committing them to sexual exploitation or removing their organs, then all of this is an offence against the Modern Slavery Act. So exploitation is again quite broad-ranging. So if you're trafficking, you can be prosecuted for lots of different things. So exploitation encompasses many different things, not just sexual exploitation, but other things too, including the removal of human organs. The second thing to note is that the Act sets up what's called a national referral mechanism, which is a framework for identifying and referring potential victims of modern slavery and ensuring they receive adequate support. This is seen as a very important part of the Modern Slavery Act, that first frontline responders, principally the police, who suspect somebody who's being treated as slave, can refer them through this mechanism where it will, in a sense, be adjudicated or decided whether they are in fact enslaved people and therefore entitled to protection. And we think something like 70% of cases, probably more, 75% of cases have been found positively. You know, these people refer through this mechanism. It has been agreed that they are enslaved and therefore should be protected. Whether the protection is adequate is a whole different ballgame. But you know, the fundamental issue of having a mechanism which decides whether these cases which are reported, suspected criminal activity, there is a mechanism to decide whether these people are in fact enslaved or not. The other thing that might intrigue you is Section 54 of the Modern Slavery Act. Now this applies to business. Section 54, and this is really to do with supply chains. It's a massively ambitious piece of legislation, this. Section 54 of the Modern Slavery Act requires that all businesses with an annual turnover of £36 million or more must prepare and publish a slavery and human trafficking statement for each and every financial year, explaining what they are doing to detect slavery in their supply chains and what remedial measures they have taken, etc. Now, this has been very controversial, not least because of non-compliance. The Act doesn't really have in it any penalties for non-compliance with Section 54, which means that some businesses have simply ignored this, while others have simply relied on their lawyers or their accountants to hastily put together modern slavery statements, which they think will pass muster, and in many cases they do. Another problem is that many of them, we now know, are not being reviewed and updated each year. The same statement is being submitted routinely every year. So there are all kinds of problems around this, but I think it's interesting that the Modern Slavery Act did choose to address the whole question of business and the question of supply chains and the need to do something about them. The thinking, I think, behind Section 54 is that this would all really hinge on goodwill and reputational damage, that businesses would not be, or rather businesses would be willing to sign up to this because they didn't want to risk reputational damage. It's not quite worked out that way, although there are some sort of pioneers in this who have really, Waitrose, and I'll come back to this in a minute. We've been working with Waitrose. Waitrose have been incredibly proactive under Section 54. And also, quite interesting, some smaller businesses that don't need to comply with this act, with turnovers under 36 million, have also come forward and said, we'd like to sign up to this and show that we are ethically clean and we're doing everything we can to make sure that our supply chains are as free of slavery as they possibly can be. Okay, so we are talking here about an extremely ambitious piece of legislation. It's not perfect, and there is all kinds of lobbying going on around Section 54 and the national referral mechanism, but it's there, and you know, we can take some credit, I think, as a country, that this is one of the first pieces of legislation of its kind in the world, and it's being places like Australia are looking at this very closely and in the process of adopting their own modern slavery acts and so on and so forth. And it's having some success. Last year, 2019, we saw one of the most successful prosecutions ever under the Modern Slavery Act. This is the biggest modern slavery network ever exposed in the United Kingdom. It involved more than 400 victims who'd been put to work by a criminal gang which had tricked them. And again, that kind of question of deception, had tricked them for coming to the UK from Poland with a promise of work, but then made to live in rat-infested houses and work in menial jobs. It's a fairly familiar story. But it's interesting, this is a massive case, and one of the first really big successful prosecutions, which has set down a marker, I think, in the UK. Despite successes of this kind, much work needs to be done, much more work, both in terms of raising awareness about modern slavery, what it is, what it looks like, and training, not least for frontline professionals. The Wilberforce Institute has taken the lead in some of these areas, or both of those areas. We've run a number of successful awareness raising campaigns, including hashtag Hidden in Plain Sight, and more recently hashtag Break the Chain, which focused on slavery in agricultural supply chains, which we launched at St. Paul's in London. We also have our own risk assessment service, which provides advice for businesses looking to comply with the Modern Slavery Act. And we provide tailor-made risk assessments for clients, among them Waitrose and Aldi. And as I mentioned earlier, Aldi have been incredibly proactive. Waitrose have been incredibly proactive on this. We did a lot of work on their agricultural supply chains in Italy and parts of France, where we went out and literally did site visits and discovered all kinds of abuses, which I can talk about if people are interested. And we've also been working with the Humber Modern Slavery Partnership to provide training for frontline professionals, including the NHS, Humberside Police, and social services. These people are key to this whole process. We had a visit a couple of years ago from a midwife, a local midwife, who came to us to say that she'd noticed that there are a number of cases where people were, women, heavily pregnant women, were being hastily brought into hospital, usually accompanied by a man who did all the talking, and then as soon as they'd given birth, being rushed out. And she knew something was wrong, but she didn't know what. And it turned out that these were actually trafficked women who were being, again, ruthlessly controlled by these men who did, as I say, did all the talking, brought them in and quickly took them out again. So training for frontline professionals is key. So NHS, Humberside Police, social services, people who have immediate and direct contact with people who are victims of trafficking or modern slavery. In situations like these, I'm often asked, what can we do? It's very, very difficult, and I don't wish to be patronizing in any way, but here are some things we can all do. Join one of the many national organizations working in this area: Walk Free, Free the Slaves, Anti-Slavery International, or better still, join a local modern slavery partnership. And there is one for Hampshire and the Isle of Wight, very active, which has a very nice whizzy website, which you can access at www.modernslaverypartnership.org.uk. And like all those partnerships, it's made up of, it's run by the police in this case, but it's made up of business representatives and others too. Secondly, be aware that abuses might be going on around you, quote, hidden in plain sight, unquote, in local businesses, services, and the hospitality industry. It's all around us, and we just don't know. Thirdly, be aware of telltale signs. Now I say this, and then when I say it, I realize that this is probably not very applicable to most of us, but I'll say it anyway. So things like inappropriate clothing, when you encounter in work situations, things like inappropriate clothing, for instance, in car washes, people who are just doing all this work in a pair of tatty jeans and torn trainers, what's going on there? The fact that these people won't make eye contact with you, appear frightened, withdrawn, or show signs of physical or psychological abuse, all of these are telltale signs. This is probably even more out of our everyday experiences, but often these people will have no ID. It's being taken away from them, and they will be dropped off or collected from work, always in the same way, especially at unusual times, either early in the morning and late at night. And that's because they're being controlled, they're all kept together, and they're moved together, often quite large distances. When we were doing work in Italy, we discovered they were being taken 100 miles to do work and then taken 100 miles back and kept together all the time. Fourthly, report anything suspicious to the police or to the Modern Slavery Helpline, 08000 121 700, 08000 121 700, or fill out an online form. In no circumstances, and I'm told to say this, in no circumstances should you intervene or confront those involved. That's the worst thing you can do, and we've had anecdotally some dreadful examples where people have tried to do that. Finally, bring the subject of modern slavery to the attention of your MPs and local city or county councillors, and demand action, and keep up the pressure. So those are sort of 5, not altogether easy things to do, I know, but sort of things you could do. As I've said, this is a big business. It's controlled by criminal gangs that operate very largely in the shadows. I think we're all realistic about the solution, and ultimately this will only be brought to heel by collective international action, not least because some of the big players, the worst abusers, are China, Russia, Pakistan. This needs concerted international action. In the meantime, what we can do here in the UK as individuals, businesses and consumers is to make it as difficult as possible for these people to operate. And I think this is our challenge, and what I would like you all to think about and probably act on if you possibly can. Thank you very much.
John, thank you very much. Yeah. John, thank you. I'm sure there are lots of questions. If people have a question, could they just wave? I know, Yolanda, you have a question. Would you like to put your question now? You need to unmute.
Yeah, I wrote it in the chat box, but
yeah.
So I was just quickly, if the speaker could address, like, what were the main elements of slavery in the past and how are they different to modern forms of slavery in your view?
Yeah, well, one of the key differences, as I indicated, is that in the past this was highly racialized. That's not as true today. Anybody could be, irrespective of the color of their skin, can find themselves enslaved. In historical slavery, this was generally a lifetime condition, and it could be inherited. That's not true of modern slavery. People often will move in and out of slavery, and they might be disposed of very quickly. Kevin Bales, who's written extensively on this, has this phrase "disposable people," which I think is, could be true of both systems, but it's particularly true of contemporary or modern slavery, in that traffickers will quickly get rid of or sever their connections with people who've outlived their usefulness. So the period of, whereas in historical slavery, often people would be enslaved for life, and in some cases cared for into old age. So there are those, I think, very kind of real differences between, between the kind of service or slavery this is, and of course the type of work they do. And the biggest difference is that in in the 19th century, slavery was legal. You know, that's why America fought a civil war to end all this. Whereas today, most states, or very few states, would actually support or say publicly that slavery is illegal. Quite the opposite, which is why it's a kind of clandestine activity and operating below the surface. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Good. Okay.
And any more questions, guys? Roger.
Roger.
Hi, John.
Hi, Roger.
I guess one of the issues which you face in this is the reluctance on the part of those who are subject to human trafficking to actually escape because of fear of the consequences. As you said, the people organising them are pretty ruthless and fear of happen to them afterwards. What sort of processes are in place for people who are, if I can use the phrase, liberated from their human trafficking to look after them?
Yeah, well, not enough really, Roger, but you're absolutely right. In fact, one of the problems, we were advising a law firm, and one of the problems they've encountered is even when they're dealing with people who have been rescued, for want of a better word, the temptation for them is to go back. You know, because they are frightened of the consequences. They're frightened of the consequences. What will happen to their families? You know, if they testify, if they're seen to be kind of rocking the boat, what will happen to them? So there is in some cases there is a reluctance for people to come forward, and particularly to testify in a court of law, which means that this is very, very problematic, and this is partly, I think, why you know, there have been criticisms of the Modern Slavery Act, because there just isn't enough being done to protect these people, either through the process or on the other side of it. This may seem a little bit bizarre to you, but if you are found to be a victim of trafficking, you're given 45 days to kind of get yourself together, and then you're off. You know, what are you supposed to do in those circumstances in terms of employment, access to, you know, support of any kind? You know, there are groups who, you know, Salvation Army, for instance, are doing an incredible job supporting people through this system and out of it. But and some other charities too that are working very hard on the ground to provide the kind of protection you're talking about. But it's random in a way, Roger, and there needs to be a much more concerted effort, I think, to tackle this. And I think if there was more of an infrastructure in place, then people might feel more confident about saying, yes, I will testify. Yes, I will participate. At the moment, it's very tempting, I think, for people to run away from the process and go back to, you know, it might seem to us extraordinary, but they'll go back to the people they know and go through more exploitation and so on.
Thank you.
Are there any more questions?
Paul, I think.
Trying to say something. Paul Eisted.
Paul?
John, it's interesting to hear this talk tonight, because last evening I was at a Zoom talk by one of our members, who's a retired Salvation Army minister. And he heads up, or is the supervisor, if you like, for the trafficking team for the Salvation Army in southern England. And they do have quite a good setup there for safe houses, for looking after the suffering trafficked people. Do you work together, or do you not have because the Salvation Army have the contract given to them by the government to do that? Is there no similar organisation for slavery?
Yeah, well, I mean, we do work with the Salvation Army, and other people do. One of the problems is because this is you know, because it's very fragmented, there is the danger sometimes of duplication of effort, and there's a real need, I think, for some kind of coordinated initiative where everybody knows exactly how you deal with this and who to go to, and you know what are the key steps. And some of these modern slavery partnerships I've mentioned have been very good at doing that kind of thing locally. Now, I don't know enough about Hampshire and the Isle of Wight, but the Humber Modern Slavery Partnership is incredibly proactive, partly because maybe that's because we're involved with it. But it's not entirely us, you know, that they've really taken this and taken the ball and run with it. And they you know, they have a wonderful network, and they know, and so it's very clear exactly what you should do in any given circumstance and where you should go and get help. But I think it's very patchy, Paul. You know, and I think sometimes people won't cooperate or don't cooperate for whatever reason. Yeah. You know, maybe some people don't like the Salvation Army. I don't know. You know what goes on there. You know,
That's right.
You know, you kind of run into these things, and you think, how can that be? Yeah.
Anybody else? Judy.
So really two questions, so I can have two. One is there were reports in America from America during the lockdown. I think it was Georgia, that 39 children were released from underground.
Yeah.
A lot of effort and a lot of investment's been put in by President Trump, actually, I understand, into releasing children. And the fact that we have a large number of missing children in this country, you know, and also hearing of children being snatched.
Yeah.
I just wonder about your view on that. The other aspect was you mentioned arranged marriages, and I was thinking of a young girl who went into an arranged Indian marriage because she was advised that it was the right thing to do because her own parents were divorced, and that is not seen to be a good marriage. You know, that seemed to be a problem for her. So she accepted the marriage and then found that she was in a locked-in situation of like being given £10 a week and having to do all the housework. And she managed to escape, but that was the closest I came to coming across that. But I just wondered, the fact that she went into the marriage willingly, whether there's a problem there, but she seemed to consent. So to ask, if you don't mind, the children issue is this something we really should be looking for? Because we seem to hear of missing children. We never seem to hear of them being found.
No, well, I think missing children is a huge, well, children generally, and child exploitation generally is a huge issue. Whether it's criminal gangs, county lines, all of these things, young kids are often being enticed into criminal activity. And interestingly, the Modern Slavery Act protects children because it assumes that they would not have consented to do that. So there is the Modern Slavery Act does, in a sense, protect children if they choose to come forward, but not many of them do. And I think there are real problems about those who are missing, lost, kidnapped, and I don't think police forces have the resources to do much about that. So that's, I think, a really big issue. And I've got colleagues who work on child trafficking and exploitation. It's become academically, it's become a field in itself, really. So the positive spin on this is that there are people working in these areas and advising the police, and we're trying to raise the profile. Forced marriage is a really tricky one. And there are some people who don't think that forced marriage is a form of slavery, and think that therefore the Global Slavery Index is suspect and shouldn't be trusted. And partly some of the reasoning around that is really to do with cultural factors. In many societies, what would be considered, what we would think as something that looks like slavery is in fact a kind of cultural expectation or norm. And for all the kind of cases where something's gone wrong, somebody will point to all the successful arranged marriages, which seem to be perfectly okay. So this means that police forces are also very reluctant to intervene in these areas, certainly without the support of community leaders. And I think this has become quite worrying, because I think, as you're hinting, this is a problem. We are aware of it, and it's very difficult for people to escape. Not least because of the fear of violence from family members. The brother of the families themselves take the law into their own hands and will discipline. As that recent case there was a whole TV, the documentary on that case of the young girl who ran away but eventually was killed by her father. Because it was about honor, and those kind of cultural norms are really, really difficult, I think, for people in this country, for law enforcement agencies and others to deal with. So it's, all I can do is sort of echo your concern, really, I think, Judy.
I think we perhaps ought to, I think I'm going to have to stop us there, because we try to keep it to an hour. But I think we could probably go on asking you questions all night, John. Maybe we're going to have you back again, I suspect. But that was fantastic.
If you're happy, I'm happy to answer more. But
yeah, I think we just tried to keep it to an hour.
Right.
You know what I mean? So
absolutely.
I think we might have to ask you back. And could I ask Roger to give a vote of thanks, please?
Yes, of course. John, that was an incredibly enlightening talk on what I think's become a pretty topical subject this year. I'm thinking mainly of the Black Lives Matter campaign that's reminded us of historical slavery. But I think what you've done this evening very clearly is to show us that slavery is not just a historical fact, but it's something that's also very prevalent today and prevalent here in the UK. And while 13,000 or whatever the figure is may not seem very big, there are 13,000 at least people out there subject to this awful form of control and exploitation. And I think you've also brought it home as well by outlining the different areas that it takes place in. And I'm thinking particularly here in Chandler's Ford, where we have what I have to say is a very good car wash. And I'm not making any suggestions about whether this applies to them, but there is a constantly changing staff of Eastern Europeans who, I don't know where they come from, I don't know where they go to. And I think that's probably not an untypical attitude, and we're very happy to go and get our cars cleaned extremely well and then drive off and forget about it. Whereas who knows, it might be going on under our noses. So I think certainly plenty to ponder on and think about. And I think I didn't manage to jot down those contact details for referrals and so on, but I think it would be helpful if perhaps they could be circulated around the club, because it seems to me this is something we've all got a part to play in. So anyway, John, thank you for your great work in this area. And thank you for being with us this evening. And it's great to see you again. So on behalf of all of us, thank you very much.
Great pleasure. Thank you very much.